Welcome to the First Baptist Church barn. And I'm Dottie Sunquist. I'm the chair of the Bennington chapter of the UVM Extension Master Gardeners, and I'm so thrilled because the car's coming in very quietly right now because Kat's not here yet, but I'm real good at killing time, so Fill the time with information about the Master Gardener program. We exist in the extension because we are the purveyors of safe, successful, and environmentally prudent gardening techniques. Things that we want you to do at home to provide healthy food to your family. We have a bunch of volunteers in the community, all across the state. As a matter of fact, every state has a collection of master gardeners. There's hundreds of thousands of us, as a matter of fact, ants. You don't know about it, it's there. And I'm excited about the Bennington chapter because we're starting to blossom. We have more new members, some folks who have just taken the course through UVM, which is a long course all spring, where you work with experts in each field in the world of agriculture, in gardening specifically. And it's that wasn't Cat, by the way. I'm just thinking, okay, keep going. We have 4 projects in Bennington County. 2 of them are right here in Bennington. 2 of them are in Arlington. The one in Bennington at the Old First Church at the Marker Garden, which is that green in front of the Old First Church, is the reason we're in this building tonight. Because Master Gardeners works in kind with organizations, with partnering organizations. Our partnering organization for the Old First Church Marker Garden is the trustees of the Village of Old Bennington, and they have spoken with the trustees of the Old First Church and have given us meeting space. So they give us meeting space, and we roll up our sleeves and play in the dirt and make their garden beautiful. So we redesigned their garden, we reworked the garden, and now we maintain the garden. But unfortunately, we're not going to come to your house to do yours because we can only do that if the garden is for historical preservation. And that's why we can do it there. We also go into communities and help in other organizations. For example, our volunteers who have to earn up to 25 hours of volunteer service a year also work at the museum's George Aiken Wildflower Trail. So that's the second project in Bennington where Master Gardeners are able to earn certification. The 2 projects in Arlington are the Fisher Pollinator Garden, which was started 4 years ago by the Gardening Club, and 2 years ago the Master Gardeners came along, and they are also part of the working with the kindergartners and taking care of the flower gardens with the children. Watering it all summer, so when the kids come back, they'll be able to be so excited because when they started off in June with their tiny little sunflowers, they tower over them, of course. So that's fun in September for the kids to see, and they harvest the sunflowers, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of education going on because we're all about teaching from the little guys up to you. I'm so happy that you're here tonight. Now, the 4th project we have just was hatched, literally this spring. It's called the Yellow Barn Community Garden. And it's the Yellow Barn on 313 in Arlington. Just when you turn off 7A in front of the Arlington Inn, you go down the hill and there's a beautiful barn. That's the site of in front of the entrance. And this year, we didn't know what was growing in it. So this year it's just take all the dead stuff out, weed it, and see what comes up and do an inventory. And then next year we're going to move a few things and rework it a little bit. And so by 2021, we'll have a really thriving showstopper because the weather's going to be.
Get right into it.
Yes, and I just so you introduce yourself because I don't want to spend any more time on my
Okay,
Okay?
sounds good.
Master composter and educator, please welcome Kat Buxton.
Thanks very much, it's good to be here. We'll need to dim the lights a little bit for this. I brought some handouts with me, and it might be good to just one stack at a time, just pass them through the crowd so people don't have to get up. I have 3 pieces of paper, and I'm just going to quickly go over those with you, just so you know what you're getting. And one of those, there are 2 sheets coming around that are composting instructions. So who here has a bin system, like a plastic bin system? One of those black plastic bins?
What, that spins?
Okay. Oh, okay, next question, who's got a spinner? Okay, sorry. We'll talk about those. And then who's got like a pallet system? Or some kind of wooden box? Okay. All right, who's got something else? And who's got just a pile? All right, great. Is there anybody here that's not composting yet?
Well, we're not successful.
Okay. But you're trying. All right, good.
Can I just ask, is this better for lights or is this you?
I'm fine either way. What's better for you?
This is better.
Okay. So of the handouts that are coming out, there are 2 that look almost exactly the same. One of them has a picture of a thermometer, and one has a picture of a black plastic bin. Those 2 are essentially the same. The difference is that when you have a black plastic bin, you're working with a different volume. So I've just changed the metrics to make it nice and easy for you. And I'm going to go over all of those steps in the presentation. But so those, I want you to know about those so that you don't have to take detailed notes unless that's what you like to do. I've already done that part for you for the step-by-step. The other handout that you're getting has a bunch of buckets on one side of it, and the other side has a squeeze test. And I'm going to go over both of those in the slideshow as well. Just want to make sure that you have all those. So my name is Kat Buxton. I run a business called Grow More, Waste Less, Food Systems Consulting. And I go all over the state working with people educating about gardening, composting, and soil health. I'm the co-founder of the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. So really, what brings me to composting is really all about soil. And so I'll talk about that a little bit in the presentation as well. If you're interested in learning more about the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, I do have a little intro sheet here. I think I might have seen someone already talk about Master Gardeners, and so I have information here if you want to know more about that program. I serve on a bunch of boards, and I work with a lot of organizations that are interested in agriculture, rural Vermont and Nova Vermont, and I have some cool stickers from them, so if you're a sticker person, come see me and I'll give you a cool sticker. What else can I tell you about myself? I run a edible schoolyard at Thetford Elementary School for the past 12 years, where we have 13 raised beds, fruit trees, apples, pears, peaches, raspberries, cranberries, blueberries, and strawberries. And we compost 200 pounds of food waste a week, which is all of the food waste generated at the school, including meat and bones. 6th graders do all the work. So, anyone can compost, including a team of 6th graders, and this is 3 classes of 6th graders that manage the compost system at the school. So it can happen. It's really just about following the recipe and the procedures. So, before I get into composting, I have a few slides where I like to sort of describe why are we composting. We'll talk a little bit about the climate change connection and soil health connection. I'll get into the universal recycling law, which I think is why a lot of you are here. Is there anyone who doesn't know about the universal recycling law, which will mandate that all food scraps need to be pulled out? Not aware of it. So I'll go over that briefly in the slides as well. But it seems like most of you are aware of that. And then we'll get right into the details of how to compost, where to compost, etc. So, why are we composting? Why is this universal recycling law put into effect? One of the main reasons was because we need to manage our food waste better. When all of our organics, whether that's food waste or wool or clothing or any kind of wood materials, end up in the landfill, what happens is they get trapped without any air. And in order for things to decompose, never mind compost, which by the way are very different. Decomposition is the rotting pile of food in the backyard. Compost is when it actually turns to humus. We'll talk about that in detail. Landfills are just a rotting pile of lots of stuff. And they're really, really huge. And when all of that mass gets put on top, we get anaerobic conditions inside the landfill. So anaerobic means organisms come in to do very, very slow decomposition, and these are organisms that don't like a lot of air or any air in some cases. And as they slowly decompose natural materials, they create gases. Some of those are really stinky, like sulfur and ammonia. Have you ever smelled those in your compost pile before? And have you ever driven by a landfill or a sewage treatment plant where you're smelling those? So that's all the same biological process that's happening. Another gas that's produced, though, is not stinky at all, but it's a lot more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of its greenhouse gas heating and trapping capabilities, and that is methane. And methane is generated from these anaerobic organisms inside the landfill. And it's estimated that landfills are actually one of the largest producers of methanes on the planet, other than things like the permafrost and some portions of agriculture. So we need to reduce methane that's going into the air. We also need to reduce food waste. Has anyone here heard about the book called Drawdown? Ooh, check it out. Paul Hawken, Drawdown. It's all about climate change, but it's all about the positive side of solutions and things that are already happening all around the world to address climate change. And the top third item of solutions that can work is actually managing food waste, because we waste 30 to 50% of the food that is produced around the world. And we all do it in our homes. So like when you go to the grocery store and you buy 3 bags of food, you might as well just drop one at the food shelf on your way home, because we're going to waste that anyway. So we can all work to change that, myself included. I'm the big fan of buying a lot of produce thinking I'm going to eat it all. And I don't always do that. Smoothies help, by the way. Smoothies are a great way to use up all that fruit. So we want to reduce the methane, and we also want to improve our soil. So globally, 40 to 60% of our agricultural land globally, depending on the source that you look at, and we are, by the way, farming every bit of land that we could be, including places that we probably shouldn't be, that used to be biodiverse forests and other dynamic ecosystems like that. But we have managed, in the past 8,000 years, and especially in the last 150 years, to turn 40 to 60% of our agricultural land into degraded landscapes, and in some places even deserts. Like Syria wasn't always a desert. And it's due to human interactions that it became a desert through the way that we produce food. The good news is we can fix that. We can fix a lot of that by the way that we manage our landscapes, and composting is one way to help to get the right organisms back into the soil that is now dead or on its way to dead. What's missing is the life in the soil, and composting is a way to build that life. Billions and billions and billions of organisms. You're gonna love microbes by the end of this talk. Microbes, so in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, you can have 75,000 species of bacteria, 1 teaspoon, 10,000 protozoa, a few hundred nematodes, a macroarthropod, or a microarthropod, and 1 mile of fungal hyphal strains. 1 teaspoon, I'm gonna say that again. 75,000 species of bacteria, 10,000 protozoa, a few hundred nematodes, a microarthropod, and a mile of fungal hyphal strands. 1 mile. So those strands are wicked tiny. Fungal hyphae strands or hyphal strands are just one little filament of fungus. When you get a lot of those together, we call that mycelium. Have you heard that word before? Mycorrhiza fungus and mycelium, these are all words that are going to become a big part of our vocabulary because they're part of what we need to heal the planet. And composting is one way that we can start to build those organisms. So we produce a lot of waste. And in Vermont, this is actually the percentage of what ends up in the landfill. So these symbols on the right-hand side are called the universal recycling symbols. And these were put together by the Agency of Natural Resources. Is anyone here familiar with those symbols? It'd be great to see these in every town across Vermont. I live on the other side of the mountains. And I live up in Sharon, about 2.5 hours from here. And where we are in the Upper Valley, you can now see these signs in every school and in hospitals and businesses and all this. It's great. As an educator, finally, we're all talking the same language, using the same signs. Who's confused about what to recycle and what not to recycle, right? We're all pretty confused about that. And it continually changes. But these signs can really help us. So notice that everything in this trash barrel, which I'm not advocating for putting this stuff in a trash can, it's just a good image that I stole from the internet, it's not mine. Everything here can be recycled or composted, except for only 15% of what ends up in the landfill should actually go there. I want to point out that although paper can be composted, at the volume that we produce of used paper, I don't necessarily recommend adding that to your compost. I myself recycle most of my paper. You can put some in the compost and we'll talk about that too. And on the left side, that's just an indication of how long things can last in anaerobic conditions, such as inside of a landfill. I once saw a picture of a carrot that was still orange, and it was 35 years old. It came out of a landfill.
How did you establish the age of the carrot?
I didn't. They did. And I don't think it's quite like a tree, you know, where you cut the slices and count the rings. I think it was from the level of the landfill that it was found at and when it was estimated that that was filled. So the best practices for reducing waste before we get into composting, I think it's really important to share the Vermont Food Recovery Hierarchy, which was created by the Agency of Natural Resources and a lot of other really well-meaning folks that have been working on this for a long time. The EPA has their own resource recovery triangle, and it's not that much different than this. So the first thing is reducing the waste at its source. So again, that 3 grocery bags that we buy, we're only going to use 2 of them, so let's think about that when we go to restaurants. And then we can also ask restaurants, like, could you serve us a little less food? Do we really need all that much? Because I'm not convinced that the higher price is making me feel better about the waste. So, you know, making suggestions like that in grocery stores and all of that from the bottom up is one way that we can help to reduce waste. And also buying the dented fruit. You know, dented fruit is still delicious. And when we don't buy it, think about the future of that product. So thinking about that, reducing waste at the source, whether it's trash, recycling, or composting. And then in terms of food, can we feed people before we compost it? So there, you know, the Vermont Food Bank. Have you heard of Salvation Farms? Raise your hand if you've heard of Salvation Farms. No. Okay. So Salvation Farms, maybe there isn't one on this side of the mountains. This is a food rescue organization.
So is that gleaning?
It is gleaning. Do you have gleaners here?
I've seen mention of that, I think on Facebook locally.
Yeah, so it's a really cool thing, and Vermont Food Bank is doing some Salvation Farms. There are other gleaners that have popped up throughout the state. In the Upper Valley, we have an organization called Willing Hands. And so these are folks that work in volunteer capacity to go out to farms and harvest before the farmer turns in the crop. Because a farmer's only going to pull out of the field what they know they can sell. It doesn't make any sense for them to do anything more than that. But they also know there's a lot of stuff there that can still feed a lot of people. They can't afford to pull it out themselves, but volunteers will do that. And the food bank and Salvation Farms are literally saving hundreds of tons of food in Vermont a year, and they're getting it to families that could eat it. So there are really great organizations doing that. Then can we feed animals? So at the elementary school that I work at, I mentioned that we compost 200 pounds of food waste a week. In addition to that, on 2 days a week, we don't compost. So 3 days a week we compost, 2 days a week we feed the bus drivers chickens and one of the teachers pigs. And the reason we did that is because the 5th graders did a report and they discovered that actually it's more responsible to feed animals before we feed the compost. So we're honoring that, and it actually has built in a really nice relief system within our school composting. So it really works well, and we have chickens and pigs that are now being fed. If you are feeding pigs, there are some USDA regulations that you need to follow, especially if you're selling that meat, so just be aware of that. 4th on the list is composting, and then anaerobic digestion. So composting is aerobic digestion, which means aerobic organisms. So that teaspoon that I told you about, those are all aerobic organisms for the most part that like a lot of air. Anaerobic organisms are those that live in a landfill. And there are these machines called digesters where we actually purposefully produce methane and then trap that methane and use it for energy. And so digesters can do that. And then the last thing is energy recovery, which is actually trapping that methane. There are options for managing the waste. You can feed animals, you can have a pickup service. Anybody here have, is there a curbside service in the Bennington area for picking up food scraps?
I don't think there is yet, but that's supposed to be.
Supposed to come to, I know Casella's is working on it. They actually just got a year extension, all haulers got a year extension from the state of Vermont for the universal recycling law because in their defense, they actually do need to have separate trucks to manage food waste. They can't really mix it with the trash. So there's some logistics that they need to work out. Yeah?
Do you think that for those of us who bring our trash to the dump, there will be a spot for us?
There is supposed to already be, according.
There is in
Okay.
Jasper.
Has it, like all the transfer stations have food?
Yeah, okay, so all the towns, as of last July 1st, 2017, or no, 18, were supposed to have bins. Some of them are using 35-gallon totes, some are contracting with farmers. Excuse me, around here it might be TAM or Casellas that they're contracting with, but there should be a place where you as a resident can bring all of your food scraps, including meat and bones. They may charge you for that if they're not doing that yet, so keep that in mind. Backyard composting is one way to do that for free. I don't recommend meat and bones in the backyard compost, but we're going to talk more about that. And the law, by the way, will not, first of all, there's no enforcement. They would pay for that. And there will be, even if there were enforcement, you wouldn't be penalized for putting meat and bones in your trash because the state is not trying to get everybody to compost meat and bones in the backyard. Although it can certainly be done, it takes a little bit more skill. And we'll talk about that. Vermiculture, anybody here have worms? Vermiculture is really cool. I highly recommend getting worms. I have a few thousand worms in my kitchen, in a bin. It's like a little worm tower, and they make beautiful castings. I brought some to share with you, so we'll pass those around a little bit. Hugelkultur is something I just want to mention. Anyone here heard of hugelkultur? Okay, you've heard of it, good. So hugelkultur, just in a nutshell, if you live in a place where, say you're in an orchard, you have a lot of forest and we get a big blowdown, lots of wood down, or you do a lot of pruning on your trees and you have a lot of wood waste, please, please, please don't burn it. That's carbon going right up into the air. We could be building soil with that. Hugelkultur is a way of just stacking wood and ramming in earth and organic matter to create highly fungal dominant communities that support incredible ecosystems. So I highly recommend checking that out. It's super easy to do. You can actually do some landscaping that way and control the way the water flows on your land. So it's a really, really useful practice.
Can you do that with pre-treated wood though?
No, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. The wood won't, because it's treated to not rot.
Yeah.
So the organisms won't move in because it's poisoned.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you are going to go with a hauler or you're going to go to your transfer facility, just please make sure that you know the yeses and the nos. Everyone's going to do it differently depending on how they're using their compost. So if you're giving compost to a farm, or if that transfer station waste is going to a farm, they don't want your fruit stickers, they don't want plastic, they don't want these compostable utensils and plates, which we can talk about that. There should be plenty of time for Q&A toward the end. I think my quotes probably told you how I feel about those things, but I'm happy to talk more in detail about the different kinds of ones that are out there. So just make sure you know what is accepted and what is not accepted, because very often your food scraps are actually going to be run through chickens before it goes to a compost pile. So any trash or contaminants that you put in there are a hazard for those chickens. Chickens can choke on fruit stickers, and it's a little gross, but I'm going to tell you this anyway. I've seen a fruit sticker come out of a chicken, totally legible. You could have scanned the UPC code, and it might have been cleaner after it went through the chicken. So they're plastic. They don't break down in the gut. So
At
they're
least
just
there
gonna
wasn't
stick
in
around.
the egg.
What's that?
At least there wasn't inside the egg.
Yeah, that's true. That would be. Can that happen? I'm not sure that can happen. So we're going to get right into composting now. These are a lot of the reasons to do it. Sorry. A lot of the reasons to do it, but I always like to point this one out because it speaks to all of us. When I go to my transfer station in Hartford, I don't bring my food waste because I compost everything. Of course, I'm a geek like that, compost everything. But I do, a couple of times a year, I fill up my truck with recycling and trash. And I don't produce a lot of trash. So, and they don't charge me for recycling, they charge me for a sticker. So I get weighed, my truck gets weighed every time I go to the transfer station before and after I dump my trash out. Because they charge me $40 for a card, and then I have to pay, it's like a 40-pound bag is one punch. My trash bags never weigh 40 pounds. As soon as you take your food waste out of your trash, you lighten the load completely. So if that's how you're charged, make them weigh you, because my 4 bags for one punch is the way it works for me. So I actually end up saving quite a bit of money by composting. Plus, I'm a gardener, I do a lot of fruit trees, and I don't really ever buy fertilizer because compost is the way to get that. So who here is a part of a community garden? Anybody? Who here is looking to do any kind of composting other than backyard composting? All right, we're going to skip this slide and just stick to backyards. So you got to choose a bin. We talked a little bit about what kind of bins you already might have. Any kind of bin will work. My least favorite is the tumblers. My second least favorite are the black plastic bins. But that's because I'm not a big fan of plastic, especially new plastic. However, they do work, and I've grown to like them a little more because now I think of them as the gateway to composting. You start with a black plastic bin, pretty soon you're going to have a big wooden bin, and then you're going to have a pile, you're going to have a windrow, then you're going to want a tractor to turn your plastic bin. Trust me. You're going to go down this road, and that's fine. So start with a black plastic bin if that's what you want to do. And I can help you with that recipe. And as I mentioned, one of my handouts is specifically for those bins, which are pretty much all the same size. You can also go really fancy. So this is one my husband built, not for me. But you know, you can make them really beautiful. So don't feel like you gotta hide it in the back of your yard. No matter what kind of bin you choose, you want to have this metal screening. That is called half-inch hardware cloth. So it's a steel, galvanized steel cloth. You can get it at any hardware store. Don't go any bigger than half-inch on those squares because rodents will fit right through it. You can go as small as a 1/4 inch, but half-inch is, I think, perfect. So if you have a pallet bin, you want to line the inside of your bin with it. And this is for rodent protection. It's also for your neighborhood dogs. So if you follow my recipe, you won't have any smell and there won't be any visual attractions to your compost pile. But if you don't follow my recipe, you're gonna have a stink, or somebody's good recipe, it doesn't have to be my recipe. You're gonna have a stinky pile, and that's what attracts the animals to it. So if you have any stink, you gotta have this stuff to keep the rodents out. Your neighborhood dog, whether you like them or not, needs to stay out of your compost pile because they could die. Did you know, anyone here ever have heard the story that a dog can die from eating compost? Yeah, it's happened to people I know, it's really sad. Even if you don't like the dog, it's really sad. So there are certain molds that can grow on certain kind of carbohydrates that are toxic to dogs. So again, if they can't smell it, they're not going to come, although some dogs are super curious, especially Jack Russells and things like that, really dig. So I just want to really get you to understand rodent protection and bear protection. Yeah.
When the composting law takes effect, will people have to screen their compost from neighborhood dogs?
There are no rules or
There's not going to
regulations.
be rules or regulations.
No, no. But if we don't take the precautions to make sure that our compost isn't stinky, we could see a rise in dying dogs, you know. But more than that, I think I'm concerned about bears. So bears are led by their nose. They're also incredibly smart. They have a big circle that they move around, maybe not a circle, but a big area that they move around within a few day or a week period. So if they find something delicious in your neighborhood, they'll be back. So don't let them find something delicious in your yard. So following the recipe is really important. But additionally, if you live in a high bear traffic area, I'm going to recommend electric fencing. Those are clearly not compost bins, those are beehives. But electric fencing during the migration time, so especially when they're coming out of hibernation, depending on the year, that's going to be April and May usually, sometimes March. Just put up your electric fence around your compost. That is also the time when, if your compost is going to get stinky, even if you're a good compost manager, that's usually the time of year it's going to stink, because we're just coming out of winter, it's just starting to thaw, you didn't deal with it for the winter, so many of us don't. So that's the time when they're going to be really attracted. So you really want to take extra precautions then in bear country. And I think it's really important because a fed bear is a dead bear. So if they get used to our compost, they're going to die, and it's our fault. Yeah.
I would have to start with a tumbler most likely. How are those at keeping bears out?
So the tumblers are pretty good if they're well constructed, and I've heard lots of stories about them rolling them down hills and they can't get in. It's pretty funny. So they will keep a bear out. And those actually, that's one reason that tumblers can be good in bear country, but you're only ever going to get it started in the tumbler. So I'll talk more about that later. But in terms of bears, yeah, those are pretty good protection. They can't really bust in. The black plastic bins, it's like a nut. They just crack it. They just, boom. Yeah, crack it right open.
Could you, excuse me, could you elaborate on the ammonia soaked rags that I saw at the bottom of that?
Yeah, it's not something I like to recommend, but that does come from people who work with bears, and it's a recommendation from them. So I'm an organic gardener, and I'm not really interested in, you know, ammonia is really powerful stuff. But if you live in bear country and you're worried about bears or other wildlife being attracted, you can take an ammonia-soaked rag and tie it to a fence, and it's just as that ammonia evaporates, the smell is repellent, and that's all.
I put some in my garden the other day because woodchuck's digging a hole. We've tried all kinds of things, and I read about that.
Oh, I'm curious if it works for the woodchucks.
I don't know.
Yeah, they'll probably just go dig another hole.
Well, he's been real busy, he's been everywhere in the yard, but this was in the garden.
They'll keep us
In a
busy.
raised bed
Mhm.
with all kinds of booby traps, and he's still managed.
No way.
So,
So no matter what kind of bin you have, choosing your site is important. One of my side jobs is I go around and do house calls for composting. I'm the compost doctor, and I show up with my long thermometer, which is around here somewhere, and I give you a prescription for wellness. Would you cast that up for me? I'd love to use it as a pointer. Thank you so much. So these are, this is a compost thermometer. You don't have to have one, but I do. And it really gives you a good indication of the activity happening inside of a compost pile. But so in this job as compost doctor, I find some really common mistakes. So I'm just going to share those with you. Then you don't have to hire me or anybody else to come in and deal with your compost. First big issue, not enough carbon materials. We're going to go over in detail what that means, and you're going to really know that by the end of the slideshow. So not enough carbon is huge. No protection is another one. So just a pile with bad ingredients, you're going to get wildlife problems. I mean, you've got a rotting pile of food in the backyard, they're going to come. And then sometimes it's location. So because you have a stinky compost pile, folks want to put it far away from their house. But don't forget, theoretically, we live in a place where there's 6 months of winter. So you're going to have to shovel. It's another thing to uncover. You know, so think of your future self when you place your compost pile. Put it near your garden, put it near your house. Don't put it underneath the eave, because your January self is going to be like, oh man, it's frozen solid now. And there's a big pile of snow on top. So don't do that. Put it on that side of the house, that's fine. I keep mine really close to my house. It doesn't ever stink. I can get there all winter long. It's not an extra path, it's one I'm already shoveling. And when we do it at school, we make sure to do it under a roofed shelter, because they're composting in the winter pretty much only. They're out all summer. So we don't want to add another task of shoveling the compost out. Slopes are hard to find, like a flat spot's kind of hard to find in Vermont. But if you can manage it, try to choose a place that's not on a dramatic slope, and certainly not on a slope right above a waterway. That's where it becomes important, because when we get a lot of rain, if your compost isn't covered, you can get what's called leachate, which is actually just pollution. It's concentrated nutrients from your compost pile leaving in waterways, and those can be damaging to aquatic organisms and anything else downstream, so be careful of those. And sun, right, so sun or shade does not matter. You do not need sun to compost. You could compost in the dark. You could compost in Alaska in the dark. It wouldn't matter. If you put your compost in the sun, it will affect how much water your compost needs, because you're going to have water evaporating. And that's really the only consideration. The heat from a compost pile comes from within. It is those billions and billions of organisms that are eating, pooping, and reproducing because they're so happy with the conditions you've created for them. That's where the heat comes from. And that's how we measure it. We measure happiness. This is like happiness thermometer. Rain protection, I do recommend. I like to cover mine with just, you'll see my bin later, just sheet metal to keep the rain out, just because I like to be in control of the moisture. So all kinds of composting need an ingredient ratio of 3:1, probably opposite what most of you are doing now. So it's 3 parts brown to 1 parts green. And this can get confusing for people because different books call it different things. So brown things are dead things, are carbon materials, all the same. So high carbon means it's brown or it's dead. Green things are high nitrogen materials, are food scraps, are living things. So those are the 2 categories. You've got browns and greens. People might refer to those differently, but those are still the 2 categories that we're talking about. Brown things, that is not an exhaustive list, but there's a little list going there. We're going to go more in detail about all kinds of brown things. I even have props I brought to show you. Green things are the living. So you need 1 of these for 3 of those, plus water, oxygen, and time. And the amount of time depends a lot on how much you are going to turn your compost. I'm not going to hang here for too long, but so don't get hung up by these numbers. If you're a math or science or a soil geek like me, you might like this. But This is just showing you the carbon and nitrogen ratio of every one of these items. So my ratio is 30:1, so is yours. All things have carbon in them. All living beings have carbon. When we're alive, our carbon is really low. When we're dead, our carbon is really high because the nitrogen leaves. Does that make sense? So if you're grass and you're green, you're high in nitrogen. But once you get mowed and you turn brown, the nitrogen left and you're now high in carbon. So grass clippings are great for the compost. If they're green, we throw them in with the food scraps. If they're brown, we throw them in with the carbon. Another thing I want to point out, right here, that's a big difference. So sawdust and wood chips of any kind of tree. Does anyone want to guess why there's such a big difference? Any foresters here or woodworkers?
Hardwood, softwood.
Yes, exactly. So hardwoods are going to have a higher concentration than a softwood. Non-leguminous and leguminous hay. So this is hay. One has alfalfa, the other doesn't. One has alfalfa and clover in it, the other doesn't. Alfalfa and clover are high nitrogen. They fix nitrogen from the air. That's part of their function in a pasture system. So I'm just going to leave it there. Everything has a carbon to nitrogen ratio, and it depends on where it is on the living or dead status as to what that carbon ratio is. So not having enough carbon really does stink. That's why your pile stinks. When there's not enough carbon, there's not enough air. So carbon provides air. I am going to just pass out some bags. There are, I think, 6 bags total. Sorry they leak a little. I bring dirt with me everywhere I go. Here you go. So feel free to open those up and, touch, feel, smell. Notice you probably have those things in your yard. They're all labeled too. And this, what I'm holding up here, is a garlic stalk. Who here grows garlic? Garlic stalks are awesome carbon material. When they're dried out like this, especially, they're hollow inside. So this is like a straw. It's a straw for microbes. This is how they're getting their air. I mean, they're a lot smaller than that. But so when you think about carbon materials, these are very high in sugars, as are lots of things that are high in carbon materials. We are feeding microbes. Your compost pile is your new pet. So think of giving it a balanced diet. It needs a certain amount of protein, it needs a certain amount of carbohydrates. The carbon materials in the diet of your microbes are their sugars. And they need 3 times more of these sugars to get the energy to digest the proteins. And the proteins are all the food scraps. So for simplicity's sake, we're calling all food scraps high nitrogen. It's clearly not totally true, because everything is on a different spectrum of carbon to nitrogen. But for simplicity, if it's food scrap, whether it's eggshells or coffee grounds or rotten kale, it is all food scraps. Yeah?
Now, the garlic stalks, would you clip them, so that they're short, or would you just throw them in long like that?
So I do it long, and I'll tell you why for the bottom of the pile. We're going to get there soon. It doesn't really matter. And in general, the smaller you chop things for the compost, the quicker you're going to get compost. And the more you turn your compost, the quicker you're going to get compost. I don't chop anything, I don't turn. So we'll talk about that. So while those are getting passed around, I'm just going to go over these. These are bean pods. If you grow dry beans in the garden, save those pods. This is hay. Doesn't matter what kind, doesn't matter how many weeds are in it. These are onion skins. If you grow onions, save all those skins. Wood chips, wood shavings, 3 different kinds. Doesn't matter how big, doesn't matter what size, doesn't really matter what kind of wood. Sawdust, again, another wood product. It's great. Shredded paper. We've got a lot of paper. I am particular about the kind of paper. So napkins and white paper, newspaper, brown paper bags, those are all kind of fine to go in the compost. Once you get into those napkins that have weird lotions and funny dyes, I wouldn't add those. I'm not really sure what's in it.
The ink in newspaper doesn't cause a problem?
It doesn't, no, so these days, primarily the ink in newspaper is all soy-based, and it doesn't cause a problem. We haven't noticed any kinds of residues building up, even on the very large composting facilities yet.
What about capturing through receipts, which I'm told I can no longer recycle because they're some sort of thermal paper. So
Yeah, probably fine. I'm not sure, some receipts are really glossy. Not sure about that. I just am not familiar with what makes it glossy. So, but probably, yeah, all of that would disappear very quickly in a compost pile. Very quickly.
Is
Yeah.
cannabis
Yes, and they're excellent for the bottom of the pile, which we're going to talk about next.
What was it?
Cannabis stalks. And this is dried leaves. So I like to, one of the bags that's going around is, it's almost leaf powder at this point because I do so many of these workshops and they've been handled so many times. But I like to use leaves in my compost. I don't use whole leaves because we probably all have leaf piles in the backyard, right? Have you ever dug into your leaf pile and come across one of those leaf pancakes? Right? That leaf pancake just created a pocket where no air can get to. So you create an anaerobic little pocket in your compost pile. Sometimes if you're digging in the leaf pile and you come across one of those pockets, you might get a little stink that comes out of the pile. That's why. So when we use large leaves, that can happen in the compost pile too, or we create these layers where air and water can't move freely. So I chop them, run a lawnmower over them. One trick I learned a while ago is you take a metal trash barrel and you put dry leaves inside and then you stick a weed whacker in there. Yeah, it works. It works. So one big thing, because we live where we do, where we theoretically have winter, 6 months of the year, we want to store enough carbon materials to get us through the winter. But we also live in a place where they fall from the sky every October, not from the sky, but up above us, every October and November. So we can collect our leaves, our corn stalks, our garden debris, our dried grass clippings, the rotten bales of hay that didn't get used in the garden or were used to bank the house last year. All of these things are really great, and I recommend keeping them dry, not because the microbes care, they actually prefer them to be moist, but it freezes. So if you don't keep them dry, you're going to have a haysicle or a leafsicle, and then you're going to be frustrated that you can't get them in the wintertime. So I like to keep them in a dry spot. For me, that's under a teepee of sheet metal. That could be a garage. It doesn't have to be heated. It could be in trash barrels with a lid. So of those items that I just passed around, a few things I want to point out were the lily leaves. Did anyone notice those? Iris and lily leaves. So who here has like way too many Siberian iris in your yard? It is the best mulch. There's no weed seeds. Cut that down. They become an eyesore in the garden anyway after a little while, depending on how you look at things. I like to cut back all my Siberian iris. They should have been divided 5 years ago. What are you going to do? I cut back all the leaves when they're done flowering. I let them turn brown, and then they become incredible compost material. Also, it's great mulch for the garden without any fear of weed seeds. So those are a resource. So there are a lot of things in our yards already. You do not have to buy any materials for your compost. Some people like to buy coir or coconut husks or buckwheat hulls or $14 bale straw. You can, but you don't need to. You don't need to buy any of that. So this is one of your handouts. And what I want to point out here is that these are 4 possible recipes of hundreds, thousands. If you don't have something on this list, don't worry. We can replace it with something else. The other thing that's important to point out is that for every 1 bucket of food scraps, And for this exercise, horse manure is considered carbon because for this handout, they're talking about horse manure with bedding. So this is manure that's coming in with wood chips or straw, and horses eat carbon. So their poop is generally a higher carbon ratio than, say, a chicken, who eat a lot of bugs and other things. So if you don't have horse manure, don't worry, not a big deal. You don't need poop. But if you have poop, microbes love it. Doesn't matter who it comes from, except cats and dogs, we'll talk about that. So for every 1 bucket of food scraps, there are 3 buckets of carbon. 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3. It doesn't matter if it's a yogurt container or a 55-gallon drum. If you have 1 of one size, you want 3 more of that size. Now the food scraps are heavy, they're wet, there's no air. The carbon isn't shoved down, it comes with a lot of air. So when I say 3 times, I'm simply talking about volume and not mass. And that's really important. One of the reasons we add so much carbon to the compost, I mentioned about the carbohydrates, and that's energy for the microbes. It's also providing them a lot of air, and it's lowering the bulk density of the whole pile by providing air and making sure that microbes all throughout the pile can breathe. If they can't breathe, they die or they turn off. And when that happens, anaerobic organism becomes active, and then you get stink. Is that clear? Carbon? Okay. So these are the stars. These are some of the stars of the show. Excuse me. These are the ones you can see with your naked eye. These little springtails are teeny tiny. Have you ever opened your compost and things go flying out? Not flying like fruit flies, that's different, but they spring out. They're like little jumpers. Those are springtails. So really cool under a magnifying glass or a microscope especially. I highly recommend getting a microscope if you want to be a soil geek. So these guys are pretty much everything you can see, or some of the things you can see with your naked eye. The billions of bacteria, the nematodes, the protozoa, the microarthropods, you're not going to see those with your naked eye. You actually need a microscope to see those. If you see these guys in your compost pile, it's a good sign. They're all good. But I do want to point out that fruit flies and house flies, and pretty much all the flies, they really like anaerobic conditions to lay their eggs. So if you lift your compost lid and out come the flies, that's a really good indicator that you've got anaerobic conditions. Perfect for flies. So flies aren't going to be bred in your compost if you have the right recipe. But if they are there, don't worry about it. You create the conditions, they either leave or become part of the compost. Okay, so this is how we layer a pile. The brown is indicating brown materials, the green is indicating green materials. It is never going to be that neat. I don't get out and measure it. I don't, it's not quite like that. That's clearly just a drawing. This is my actual compost here. And now I want to talk about the bottom. So notice there's brown all the way around the outside. That's called a biofilter. In my handouts, I mention that word, and I also talk about a donut. This is the donut. Do you see that shape of the hay? And then I talk about the donut hole. That's what I'm talking about in the handout when I'm talking about that, the center of the pile. So we start the bottom of the pile with about 10 to 12 inches. If you've got a big pile or a big bin, and these metrics are all in your handouts. If you have a black plastic bin, this is where you're going to start going smaller, because if you put a foot of dried stuff in one of those bins, you're almost full. So you're going to just shrink the amount. This is all hollow. So this is the best place for your corn stalks, your sunflower stalks, your garlic stalks, your perennial stalks like phlox and bee balm, and so many that are hollow inside. They're perfect straws for the bottom of your compost pile. And you want to crisscross those like a tic-tac-toe board so that you're building an infrastructure for air underneath. Even when you have a mass on top of it, there's going to be some structure underneath allowing for the heat inside the pile created by those organisms eating, pooping, and reproducing to create convection from outside, underneath, and up through the center of the pile. So that structure is really important. This is so easy. If you don't have corn stalks, I bet you can find some. I know it grows all up and down this valley. Sunflowers too. Those lily stems, you know, the iris stems, the ones that are more hollow, those would work. If you don't have any of that, you could use sticks, but sticks take a long time to break down. So your future self is going to be like, why'd you put all those sticks in the bottom of the pile? Because now you're digging it out and they're getting all caught up in your shovel and your blade. So just keep that in mind, that your future self might not be so happy with that and would wish that you had just gone to get some corn stalks. Yeah?
But how often do you do the bottom of the pile?
Once a
In one
year.
of those bins?
Once a year.
Okay, because when I take the bottom stuff out, then the stuff on top falls down, and I just keep adding more stuff to the top.
So that
I never
actually,
get to the bottom.
we're going to talk about that too, but before when I was talking about the 3 things, I think I only might have listed 2 from the compost doctor work that I do. The third one is that no one ever wants to call their bin finished to start a new one. So we'll talk about that.
What are the base dimensions of that illustration of your compost?
This one is 4 by 4. I'm not sure about this one. And this one is 4 by 5. So this is my actual compost bin at home. It's 4 foot wide and it's 5 foot deep. It doesn't, you know, doesn't have to be. 4 by 4 is great. You don't want anything smaller than 3 by 3. You just won't have the mass to create the heat, especially in our environment where we freeze. In those black plastic bins are 3 by 3, so that's really about the smallest you want to go. So why I'm doing this, so I start this, I've got my crisscrossed hollow stem, whatever I can throw down there. By the way, it's also a great place for broccoli stems and Brussels sprout stems and all those items that remain in what finished compost you've managed to get, put those at the bottom. And if you're not building the pile right then, create a stack of future bottom materials so when you get there, you've got them all. It doesn't really matter how old they are, as long as they're not rotten. Well, and then they can still go in the compost, they're just not going to serve this function very well with the structure. So that's step 1. Step 2 is I make a nest of hay, like a donut. And then I take my food scraps and I put them right in the center. And now I've got all this hay that I can pull from for my 3 buckets, and I pull it over top of it. So a lot of my carbon storage is actually right inside the bin waiting for me for next time. If it's not quite enough, then I add a little more on top from my stores. The more diverse you can get with your carbon materials, the better. So none of us like to eat just rice or just pasta. Your microbes are really no different, seriously. They like a diversity. And the more diversity of foods for them that you put in there, the more diversity of organisms you will get, which will ultimately help your garden and soil health and nutrient cycle in your gardens. And one other thing. So this, as we're going to go through this a few times, but as I go and I build this up, this biofilter is built all the way around the bin. When I look from the outside in, you should never see food scraps. You should only see your carbon materials, whatever that mixture is.
So in this example, would it be about 6 inches of something, and then another 6 of the brown, and then?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that about how tall?
Yeah, it's about 6 to 8 inches, something like that. And if you're using the black plastic bin, shrink that in half. This is about 4 to 6 inches wide for my bin. I would shrink that to a couple of inches for the black plastic bins, just so you have some room for your food scraps inside. And I've been doing this for years, never had any animal issues. I make beautiful compost, and I'll pass that around in a minute too. And somebody here wanted a bag of compost. Who's that? I got it. Okay. So starting the pile, I'm going to just repeat what I just did. Hollow stems, crisscrossed on the bottom. This is from a plant called Silphium. Do you know that plant, anybody? Cup plant? So it's a really tall, I saw some flowering on the way here, really tall, very large leafed plant that the leaves come down and form a bract that forms a cup that actually holds water. So it's great for birds. It's got this little sort of sunflowery flower on top. It comes pretty late. Again, the birds love it. I have one that's about this wide in a bunch, you know, really tall. And it provides enough bottom layer for my compost every year. That one.
What's it called again?
Silphium. Silphium. And just find someone who's got it, take a chunk, you're good. Yeah. A lot of nurseries don't really have it anymore. It's kind of an old plant. It's not a super sexy plant, but it's a very functional plant. So I like to have it. Okay, so you've got your dry hollow stuff. You're putting that on the bottom in a crisscross pattern. And then you're going to form your donut on top of that. The biofilter is the thick layer that goes all the way around the outside. The biofilter is a smell barrier. It is a visual barrier. It retains moisture inside your compost pile. It retains a little bit of heat inside your compost pile. And it provides you with ready carbon materials.
So you're saying you just stack up everything on the sides and then pull it in as you need it?
Yep, so when I come in, say I got a 5-gallon bucket of food scraps. I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna dump the whole 5-gallon bucket right there. And then I'm gonna take my hand or my fork or
Yep.
maybe something a little more sanitary than my hand, and just kind of spread it out so that my food scraps are no more than 4 inches at a time. I'm not getting the ruler out, you know, so whatever. And trying to make sure that my food scraps are no more than 4 inches and my carbon materials are no less than 4 inches. Okay? They can go higher because your carbon materials are fluffy. Come with a lot of air, and that is a really important part of why we're using those carbon materials. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to dump my food scraps, I'm going to spread them out. If it goes more than 4 inches, then I'm going to mix some carbon in with it. And then I'm going to cover it with carbon materials. In this case, I'm just using hay. Maybe you have a mixture, maybe it's sawdust, maybe it's wood shavings, maybe it doesn't matter, really. But smaller particles are going to fall out of a bin. And notice that my bin does not have a 1.5 inch hardware wall.
So you do
Calling
this
myself
inside
out.
of a tumbler too?
No.
You're not layering?
Layering doesn't work inside of a tumbler. The part of the deal with tumblers, all right, this is what I'm going to tell you about tumblers. So when you turn a tumbler, it goes flump, 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 right? So all the air left. Your microbes are like, ah! And you're not blending materials. So you're never going to, and how are the worms and beetles going to get in? Right? They need access. It's critters that are doing the work. The worms and the beetles are the ones we can see. They generally come in later. So a way that a tumbler can work is A, to hold your food scraps until you can get out to your compost bin. So like for winter time, it could be a really useful thing to have something, but they fill up really quickly. Another great way that I've seen them used, mostly at schools for educational purposes, is to start compost that way. So you can get things activated and partly broken down, and then take that and add it into a compost pile. And even in bear country, that's preferable in some cases. I have never, in all the years that I've been doing composting, seen finished compost come from a turning system. Ever.
How about standing it upright on occasion, like putting in a lot of leaves or something?
It's still the same principles of there's no highway transportation system. Where's the air coming from? You're beating them up, and the moisture is just like thunk, thunk, thunk. So it's a nice idea, but they don't work. If anyone in this room has had experience where you have seen the opposite. I want to know, because I keep asking and no one ever has reported back that they've had finished compost. So it can be a good first step, but that's an extra step. And for a population that isn't finding the time to compost in the first place, it seems silly to add extra steps. So generally when I work with schools, and I work with a lot of schools, I say, unless you're in high school and you're gonna like do microscope experiments and like actual decomposition breakdown along the way, don't bother with the tumbler. It's just another step and another thing to clean. So sorry.
Well, you can use it to store your carbon.
You can absolutely use it to store your carbon, and they're excellent for that. Yes, they're pretty airtight, which is part of the problem, right? And they're waterproof, which is also in some ways part of the problem for composting, but perfect for the carbon materials. Also, the black plastic bins, once you graduate from those and you move up, those are really great carbon material storage centers. Okay, biofilter, deposit. So it's the bank, right? The compost bank, it's your new pet. We make deposits in there. That's the way I like to think about it. Always put your greens first, and then your browns. So this is a thermophilic hot compost system. There's no biofilter, because this is actually the system at school where we fill a 4x5x4 bin every 35 days. So we don't do the biofilter thing because we actually turn this system from bin to bin. So that's a turning. Thermophilic is just indicating the kinds of organisms that live there. They like really, really high heat. If you want pathogen kill in a high heat system, such as a school, you have to reach 131 degrees everywhere in the pile for 3 days. So the way to do that, to get everywhere in the pile, is to be turning. So at school we turn. But the reason I have this up here is always put your food scraps in first and follow with your carbon materials. These carbon materials that you're looking at are horse manure with bedding, paper towels, and wood shavings. So this again is the elementary school. When we started composting at the school, Thetford, 7 or 8 years ago, I can't remember, it's all a blur now, but they became really highly aware of the waste that they produce. And within the first year, they really tightened up their recycling. They realized that instead of shredded paper for their compost, they could use their own brown paper towels, which are produced readily at an elementary school where kids wash their hands every 10 minutes. So now we don't have to bring in paper at all. We use only our brown paper towels for that portion of our recipe. And that school has reduced their overall waste by 75%. And we've sustained that for years. And we know that it's a very simple equation. We used to get a dumpster a week. Now we get one a month. That's great. That's it. And that's a school of 200 kids in Thetford. So it can be done, and the school has now actually since then gone to a bulk milk machine because they realized that milk cartons are not recyclable and they're a problem, so they went to bulk milk. Yeah.
How do they turn that?
Oh, 5th graders. I'll show you. We might sell it to raise money for 6th grade for their trip. Do we sell to 5th graders? No, we don't. Yeah, we don't have permission to do that. We're going to get to the turning part, and I'll show you the 5th graders at work. So the temperature and the moisture, if you're a geek and you're interested, you can learn about this sort of thing. You do not have to do any of this stuff. I love to do it because when I see the compost temperature rise, I know that the microbes are happy. And then when I see it drop, I know they've used up all the air. And that's when it's time to turn. So if you want to know when to turn, a thermometer is a really easy way to figure that out. And all you have to do is get one of these, or you can use a meat thermometer, but they're generally only about 1 foot. You want to go in as far as the last deposit. For us, that's 1 foot or 2. I also have a 4-foot thermometer for really large piles. And so we're just looking for a temperature drop, and the kids chart it. They take, at the school, they chart the temperature and the moisture every day. They do the temperature in 3 places every day that they dump, so 3 days a week. And then all of that math actually becomes the basis for their math curriculum, all of that data. So it's a really useful project for schools. If you have a school nearby that wants to compost, I highly recommend it if they're going to make it an important part of their educational curriculum. Schools should not be in the business of managing waste unless they're using it as an educational tool. And there's so much to be done with the education and composting. We have such great curriculum at that. So you can do the temperature. It is a very useful tool. And moisture is super important. So you want the compost pile needs to be the consistency of a wrung out sponge. So, and that's about 55% moisture. You can get a fancy tool that measures moisture for you, but I like to use my hands. The kids, we give them rubber gloves because they're a little freaked out. So what you do is you reach into your compost, not into the food scraps, because that's clearly going to be gross, but into a place that looks like it's partly broken down, or mostly broken down. You reach in and you grab a handful and you squeeze it as hard as you can. And this is on your handout. It's super simple. Squeeze it as hard as you can. You should see beads of moisture form between your fingers. That's perfect. If it drips, it's too wet. And if it's too wet, you need to add carbon to absorb that moisture. If you open your hand, if there's no drips and you open your hand and it falls apart, it's too dry. So then you want to get the hose and give it a nice, really good misting. Ideally a turn and a misting so that you can make sure the moisture gets all the way down. If your microbes don't have enough moisture, just like us, they'll be pretty unhappy and they might even die or turn off. So they need moisture, they need air everywhere in the pile, not just in some places. Other observations to be looking for, like what does it smell like? Are there flies or other insects around? So be noting that sort of thing too. Turning adds air to the pile. When you follow my instructions for building the pile and the recipe, you're adding air all the time with your carbon materials. So you don't need to turn it. If you want compost quicker, turn it. If you turn your compost every day, you could have finished compost within a month. Yeah. If you use the right recipe and you turn every day, you'll have finished compost very quickly. Yep. That's what they do at the big composting facilities. They just have giant piles and big machines. And if they don't turn it every day, you know, their piles could explode, which actually, did you know that about landfills? Landfills explode because of those little microbes making gases in closed pockets. So that's why we have stacks coming out of landfills that we burn. That's burning off those gases. Those same gases, many of them could power our cities if we could trap that gas. But yeah, so air and water is super important. Turning adds air. It speeds up the process, and of course it cools the pile. So if you're trying to get pathogen kill and you want to turn your pile, you have to know that you're going to go down below the temperature you need for pathogen kill. So, like if you're an organic farm or any kind of farm that's using that compost on food crops, there are regulations that you need to follow for turning. And you typically are letting your pile get up to 150 degrees so that when you turn it, it doesn't drop below 131. So I'm not going to get too much into those details because that's up above beyond backyard composting, but it can totally be done. You can compost anything. Whole cows can be composted in a pile. It's called mortality composting. There's a special recipe for it. It's been done as long as people have managed livestock. This is not a new process. Did I see a hand? No, okay. Pretty soon we're just going to open it right up to questions for the rest of the time. So if you're in a hurry, go ahead and turn it. There's the 4th and 5th graders. It takes them a whole week of recess time to turn 4 bins, and they're willing to do it because it's part of the school system, and we give them a popsicle on Friday. But not until Friday. And sometimes the kids will be like, oh, I don't really need a popsicle, because they want to be all like, I'm just giving to my community. And they're like, really, you don't want a grape one? They're like, oh, okay, I'll take it. But it's cute that they aren't just wanting to be of service. So this is how we do it. Shovels, shovel from one into a wheelbarrow, turn it into the next bin. The front of these bins all have removable boards.
Yes, I know.
So that makes it really easy to go from one bin to the next, and they can handle it. If you're lucky enough to have a big tractor, you could actually make sure to size your bin for the bucket, and then use that instead of 4th graders. But they're really cute, aren't they?
What kind of lollipops do tractors like?
So this, just one more quick thing about the thermophilic bin in case you're curious. This is the bin at Thetford Elementary before it had the tops and the fronts. Makes a really good diagram. This is how we do it. We always, because we're working with 200 plus people, always dump in the same bin. Always, always, always. When it gets full, the whole thing gets flipped here, and then we start filling here. When this gets full, the blue goes to the green, etc., 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 until we finally turn out. So every pile gets turned 4 times before it goes out into a windrow like that. Back to the backyard system. This is my beautiful compost system, and my fancy lid. That's my old roof, and we use the wood that's just too hard to split to put on top. I do like to cover because I like to control the amount of water that goes in there. During time of drought, the lid will help to keep condensation moving through the bin, and during times of rain, it'll keep too much moisture from going in there. You can remove the lids as needed to get moisture in there, use your keeping to that wrung out sponge consistency. So the way that I like to do this, and I like to encourage people to do this, is start your bin in November. I recommend 2 bins because you want to be able to let one finish. So you start in November because that's when we have corn stalks and sunflower stalks and leaves and straw and all of these things. And we're getting ready to go into winter, so we want to make sure we have a bin with plenty of room to handle winter food scraps that are likely going to not decompose as quickly because it'll freeze. And most people's compost freezes in the winter. That's totally normal. Mine does not. It is possible to have your compost not freeze by feeding it the right recipe. As long as those microbes are alive and happy with enough insulation and mass and food, they're not going to freeze. The top of my pile will freeze, and then I just put my spade fork right through it. It's a ½ inch frozen, and then steam comes pouring out even when it's -20 outside. So it can totally happen. So in November, start with your stalks on the bottom, make your donut, and start your bin. And take the one you've been using all spring, cap it, meaning put one last bit of carbon deposited on top, and walk away from it. Then, start filling the bin you start in November. You fill it all winter long, doing your donut in your donut hole and building up your biofilter. By the time spring comes along, you probably still have room left in your bin because it hasn't filled all the way. Your other bin in spring is going to start to thaw out. It takes a little while because it's insulated, right? So you'll have like a little compost ice cube with straw around it. Once it thaws out, it shrinks down. The one you're filling now also shrinks down because of the activity. You have time to get all the way to November in that bin. And the one you did last year, you should be able to dig that up in June and have it be completely done. So let it go for a year and then turn it out. So then there's a curing phase if you want to be geeky about it and you have enough compost that you're not just eager to use it right away. This is a finished pile of mine. Notice that the outside hay is there. Of course it is, because the hay is just exposed to air. It doesn't have the right recipe. The function was for it to be a biofilter, not to be composted. So I pulled this out of the bin, and it turns into one pile of hay. This was actually 3 bins worth. So there's 1, 2, 3 piles of finished compost. I sifted the hay out just with my hands, so you can see lots of hay in there still, just little bits. This goes right back into the system for next year. And now I've got my finished compost. This is a pile that I pulled out in the middle of winter. After many years of doing this, we've decided we are never pulling compost out in the middle of winter again. So we build it in November. It's a very simple system. And I'm going to just pass around a few bags of compost. So there are, these little bags are worm castings. One is sifted, one is not. And these two big bags are compost. One is sifted, one is not. This one is yours, by the way, so we'll make sure it goes back to you, but if you don't mind sharing it too. I don't sift my compost, but you'll see the bag that comes around that's sifted is really, really nice. I just sift it to show off at my classes, but I don't ever actually do that. That would be ridiculous. Maybe if I were gonna like use it for a potted plant that I was giving away to somebody, maybe then I would do it, but I don't do that. So curing your compost is when you put it in a windrow. So like this last slide, that one is a windrow at school, that is a windrow at home. At home, it's just a pile. At school, we have so much of it, we do these long skinny piles. And this is a special kind of fabric that's called compost fabric. Compost Tech makes it, and it's breathable, so water can get through, air can get through, but seeds can't, and not so much water that you're going to get leachate. So the difference between finished and not finished, really, if you're not sure if it's finished and you really care about that, give it one last turn, stick a thermometer in there. If the temperature rises, it's not done yet. If it stays at ambient temperature, it's done. That's how you know it's truly finished. Does it matter if it's finished? Depends what you're using it for. If you're putting it in the garden with fresh greens, the more finished the compost, the better. If you're using it under your fruit trees, it can look chunky like that. As long as there's no recognizable food to attract the skunks who are going to dig up your roots or whatever, then it's fine. So it really doesn't matter too much, but I have so much compost that I just use the very best at this point. So that's it. If we could turn on the lights, and I'd love to answer your questions as best that I can. There are no bad questions, so ask them all, please.
How large are your bins?
How large are my bins?
Yeah.
My wooden bins are 4 by 4, 4 foot wide, 4 foot tall, and 5 foot deep. And that's,
And you have 3 of them?
I have 3 of them. Yeah.
And that keeps you in?
Yeah, it keeps me going. I mean, it takes us 1 year to fill 1 bin. Yeah. And so 3 bins is nice because then you can have your 3rd bin be a good place to store your dry carbon materials. And then have 2 bins, one that's active, one that's curing. We're waiting until next year. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, I didn't mention pine needles, and can they be a part of the carbon? And yes is the answer, absolutely, perfectly fine. I do want to say, oftentimes people are confused about pine, citrus, and lavender or tea tree, things like that. So all of those are antibacterial. That's why we use them in soap. There's pine soap, there's citrus soap, lavender soap, tea tree soaps. They're all antibacterial. But all that means is there's a volatile oil that comes with those when they're fresh. And we harvest that oil to make the soaps. But if you leave any of those materials out, that oil goes up and then it decomposes. So people will say, oh, you can't compost pine, wood, needles, whatever. Well, if that were true, we would be swimming in pine needles because we live in a pine forest, right? So it's not true. Yes, you can compost all pine products, all citrus products. It will take a little bit longer for them to break down. That's it. Yeah.
Do you use sawdust from pressure treated?
I would not use pressure treated sawdust. I wouldn't use any pressure treated wood products because they're soaked with things that microbes can't survive in. So it won't break down at all. I wouldn't even use pressure treated in the compost bin itself. Yeah.
If you find piles of mold in your compost and toadstools growing, is that fine?
So the question was, if you find piles of mold and toadstools growing, like mushrooms growing out of your compost, potentially. It depends how fresh that is. So if that's old compost and you're not seeing any recognizable food, then yes, it's going through the saprophytic phase of decomposition using mycelium, which likes it cool. So most fungal dominant compost, which that's like, it's important for soil geeks to know the difference between fungal dominated and bacterial dominated. Fungal dominated compost likes very cool conditions. So heat will kill most fungus. If there are moldy sections and they're because of the food item, like if it's bread or something, just stick something in there, stab it a bunch, get some air in there, mix it around, it'll be fine. Toadstools, same thing really if it's an active pile, but if it's a cool pile, fine. And when you use that in your garden, it might actually be more helpful than you thought. Yeah? Can you let it cure too long? No. Because, I mean, I guess that depends who you ask, but the thing is compost is not, don't think of compost as actual nutrition for your plants. There are very few available nutrients for plants in a compost pile. What the compost is doing is bringing billions of organisms into your soil where they came from originally, along with some food for them to eat and conditions for them to thrive. And those organisms break down sand, silt, and clay, bringing all the nutrients from the subsoil up to the plants where it's available. This is how forests and natural ecosystems all around the globe survive. Nobody is spreading bags of fertilizer in the forest. So agronomists and chemical companies will have you think that you must have bags and bottles in order to have your plants get nutrition. So that's not the case. So when it comes to compost and is it too old, if it's way old, at some point there might not be much active life in there, but it's still going to be an excellent medium to add the right conditions into soil. So it can be too old if the reason you're using it is because you want really good organisms. But if you're just looking for fluff and substance for your soil, then no. It can't be too old.
Okay, so I've got my compost.
Yeah.
It's ready to go. Is there a ratio to mix it in with the soil?
You know what? So I don't actually mix it with the soil. I'm a no-till gardener these days, so I add it on top. And I let the worms and beetles do the mixing because they're much better at it than I am. And they bring it right to where it needs to go. But you can never add too much compost to a growing
What you
system.
just described, you would rototill, then plant, then lay the compost over it?
If you were, no, so if you're tilling, I would add the compost with your till.
Okay.
So you till it in.
I would till it in if you were tilling. If you're not tilling, and I recommend learning how to not till, at least for as many crops as you can, then you just apply it right on the top.
But the first time through a clay soil, you probably want to rotate the soil to get a lot of the rock out, no?
Possibly. Depends what you're growing, but possibly. Yeah. Clay's, yeah. Not a lot of airspace in clay.
No.
Yeah.
A lot of water.
Right, right. But lots of nutrients. Clay is so rich with nutrients. This side of the room. Anybody?
What about
Yeah.
the danger of pathogens from your compost if it didn't get hot enough going into a vegetable? Is there some danger there?
Potentially.
Danger?
Yeah, which is why, one of the reasons we don't compost meat and dairy in the backyard or bones. So those are primarily where the pathogens are gonna come from. Other places pathogens could come from would be poop, I guess, but it depends who and what they ate.
Oh, right, you were gonna talk about why we don't
Right.
post our cats.
So cat and dog feces is a place where certainly pathogens could come, and not only just pathogens, but those that can be transferable to humans, which is a big part of the consideration. So many other animal manures aren't carrying pathogens that are transferable to humans. And pretty much most of the compost you see coming off of farms doesn't reach 131 degrees. So most of the food that you're eating now is grown with ingredients that were not pathogen-filled. I don't know a single farmer who composts properly in terms of pathogen kill. They don't have time. They don't have time. It's not their fault. And that's part of my job is I do help farmers learn how to compost better. But so pathogens, if you're concerned about that, you can certainly send it off to a lab. But it really ties back to what ingredients are you putting in your compost and how would the pathogens have got there. Did that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay. So cat and dog feces, let's just talk about that real quick. I don't think putting it in a plastic bag and putting it in the landfill is a solution. It's totally natural. Yes, it can be composted, but don't put it in with your garden compost. So I have a separate compost pile for my cats, and all their cat poop goes in there. I also use litter. That is, I use those horse pellet bedding. You can buy it for like $3 for a big bag at the feed store, and it's great. My cats are totally cool with it. I don't use that clay stuff because it's a problem, and it's generally really concentrated. And I remember as a kid, we tossed it over the side of the road, and I remember the big, like, permanent pile of gas, you know, like, I don't want to do that. So I use, I've tried everything. I use oats, I've used all sorts of things, but those wood pellets are great. And I just have a separate compost pile, wood pellets, cat poop, and weeds go in there. And then that finished product goes out on my lawn. I don't use it for my food because I'm not taking the temperatures. I'm concerned about the pathogens. And I have plenty of compost. So that's what I would do with feces. Yeah.
Maybe I don't understand pathogens. So if you have some compost that does have pathogens in it and you're putting it around your tomato plant, how does the pathogen get into the tomato that you
So
actually
that,
eat?
it's happening through soil. Generally those things are in contact with soil. I don't want to freak you out about pathogens. So the food that you eat now is grown without, or it's grown with products that are not tested for pathogens. So like bios, you know, they're not doing that. And so time is another thing that kills pathogens. If you don't get heat, time will kill it. So, you know, a compost that sits around for 2 years isn't going to have any pathogens. And pathogens are just simply bad bacteria, you know, they're everywhere, they're all over us. And it's really about having the right balance of good bacteria so that the pathogens don't get hold or overpopulated. So that's why sick people die quicker from pathogens because they're already leaking. So I don't think you need to worry. If you're composting anything that's high in pathogens, like meat, bones, or feces, then you would want to be concerned and make sure that you get your pathogen kill temperatures. The other thing about that temperature, 131 degrees, everywhere in the pile, that kills weed seeds. If you don't get that temperature, you're not killing weed seeds. Weed seeds of any kind. Or cucumbers or melons or squashes, and that's why we get these like amazing volunteers out of our compost pile because they don't get killed in there. So just keep that in mind. And some people ask me, well, why should I use hay in my compost then if that's only going to spread weeds in my garden? And that's a really good consideration. The hay I get is from the field right in front of my garden. So all those weeds are very much present in our landscape. I'm not getting anything new. But it is a good point to think about if you're going to buy hay or get hay. I don't recommend buying it unless you're buying it from a hay farmer who's selling it for that reason. Make sure you know what's growing in your field so that you don't pull into problems.
Would you use straw instead of hay to avoid that?
Yes, straw is awesome, but it's super expensive unless you happen to grow your own cereal grains. So the difference between straw and hay is just from a field and it could have lots and lots of different species. Straw is from one cereal grain crop, typically at a time, so it's going to be rye or barley or wheat or oats or something like that. And that bale might come with chaff on it and some seed, So you'll get, if it's oat straw, you might get an oat crop growing in your garden underneath it, or rye. So just know where it's coming from. And I'm a little shocked that the feed stores often don't know what cereal grain their crop came from. Yeah.
One thing, I wonder what you would say about this, but I would be concerned about, say, gathering corn stalks or whatever, because perhaps that might be GMO corn, or it might have been grown with glyphosate or high nitrogen fertilizer, and unless the process breaks it down that quickly.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. So the good news there is that we are finding, although there isn't enough research yet because the vested interests, but we are finding that compost is an amazing remediation tool for lots of chemical problems, including pesticides. It's certainly not true for some. I don't know if anyone remembers, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, there was a story about green mountain compost.
Yes.
So they were getting hay from a horse farm in Canada, and that hay crop there was a pyrrolid pesticide. It's a class of pesticides, herbicides actually, that was used on this field. They didn't break down in the cow's stomach or in the composting process, and ended up in growers' greenhouses where their seeds didn't sprout. So, case in point, there are absolutely some things that you would want to make sure. So if you're getting hay, I always tell farms, if you're importing hay for composting, you have to make sure that you're not getting it from somebody who's using those pyrrolid class pesticides. There may be others, we haven't done the research. We believe that glyphosate is one of those that does break down pretty quickly with the microbes. So these billions of organisms really do amazing work for us, and some of the best information I've gotten about remediation and composting is actually from the military. So they're using composting to deal with munitions and all sorts of problem materials because microbes can break things down to their original components. So it can be useful, but do keep that in mind. Thanks for bringing that up. And I just want to point out, I don't know if folks know, this is Judith Schwartz, who's one of my favorite authors, and she lives right here in Bennington. Yeah.
In Brattleboro, they use collect urine separated from feces to bring nitrogen in.
Yeah.
Would you put that in compost or directly in a garden or what?
Well, I know they're doing some really interesting research, and I love what they're doing down there. You could absolutely. Some people take urine and just mix it with water and water their garden.
Well,
just
they
like that.
recommend a ratio of 1 to 10 if you're going to do that.
Yeah, they're super into the science of it. Yep, and I would rely on them because they're doing the research. You can compost human manure. There's a great book out there called Humanure by Joseph Jenkins, and he goes around the world working with people to help them learn how to compost human manure. This is not a new process. Humans have been on the planet for a really long time. We've known how to do this. Some cultures never did it well and caused all sorts of famine and problems and pathogen spreading and disease because they didn't manage it well. But pooping in our water is definitely not a good idea, and that's what we do. So composting it is way better, and urine is a part of that. And it's interesting that they're interested in urine diversion.
Well, they have actually got special toilets to separate the
urine
from your shit, basically.
Yeah, it's great.
Because if your feces gets in the urine, it ruins the urine for what you want to do in the garden. So you got to kind of pee in a bucket, like the old-fashioned way in the old houses around.
Right. Well, the Joseph Jenkins way is showing you how to do both number 1 and number 2 in the same place in a compost bin. So check that out. His book is actually a free download online.
What's his last name?
Joseph Jenkins, and Humanure, one word. And he's done some really incredible work in countries like Haiti, where they need management of feces and urine, and you can build soil. I mean, it's a really incredible, super simple. You need nothing but a 5-gallon bucket and a compost bin to manage your entire septic system. Highly recommend checking that book out, and I've got a lot of experience with that myself. Yeah.
We had all the toilets up the Garlic Fest last year.
I was first introduced to that.
Oh, good.
Right,
To the urine diversion?
right.
Oh, that's great.
All lined up, everything else. That was
Rich Earth is
fascinating.
really doing some great work.
You-
It's very
Do you
exciting.
advocate just throwing it in your compost, just from you, just?
I would say it would be perfectly fine to throw it in your compost. The one thing that I'm not sure about, and I'm looking to Rich Earth for their research, I don't know that it's been finalized yet, is pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals can be concentrated and they can show up in our urine especially. So that is not something I'm super knowledgeable about, and there's so many different kinds of combinations of pharmaceuticals. I think it would take quite a bit of research to really figure that one out and understand it. So that's just a caution. If you take pharmaceuticals that could be concerning, then I wouldn't do that. Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar with what the universal recycling law mandate is, and this is obviously a group of gardeners, but I'm coming from a place of, as an apartment dweller or in a house in a residential area where I don't have my own gardens and my own scraps for the carbon, and what am I supposed to do? What is
Okay.
the law for me?
So my understanding of the law is that every town transfer facility, so wherever you already bring, do you have a place you already bring recycling? and
No,
trash?
they pick it up.
So that curbside service is going to be required to provide that for you. If you do not have a facility within 20 miles of where you live or a hauler pickup, you're not required to follow the law.
So whoever picks up the garbage and the recycling will pick up the compost or food scrap?
Yeah, so they'll have a separate container. Your local solid waste district should be able to answer your questions on that and point you in the right place.
So I don't have to compost, I have to.
We got Bennington County Solid Waste Alliance right
okay.
here.
Yes, if you live in a multi-unit facility of at least 4 units or more, your hauler is required by law to pick up your food scraps for you as of July 1st, 2020 next year.
What if it's a house?
It's a house, that's a matter of whether your owner of your apartment,
Or,
townhouse or whatever wants to ask for commercial service, but they're not required to.
so my parents have a house and they have TAM and they come and they pick up their, I think it's TAM, the garbage and the recycling. So they will also pick up the food scrap?
That's
Yeah, they should.
That's up to TAM if they want to do it. Now, TAM was just bought out by Casella, and with the new legislation that went through this past session, they were exonerated from having to do residential pickup of single-family houses.
Until future notice or just?
They were off the hook, yes.
Oh.
So going forward, you either have to compost or take your own scraps to the transfer station or find a farmer. There is no residential pickup mandate for haulers for residential service.
But don't you foresee lots of people just putting it in their garbage as they always have?
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Now, for Bennington, like my parents have not heard any of this and are not familiar. I don't think the typical person in Bennington knows anything about this.
No, they don't. They're gonna know about it though. That's my job over the next year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, and so I also want to say that the law has already resulted in a huge amount of organics not going to the landfill and staying in state where it's being made into compost that is then being applied to soil to improve soil health. So even if some people still end up throwing their waste in the trash, it's already been an awesome thing, and it's only going to get better as we fill the gaps in places to be able to compost and train more farmers to do it if they want to do it and take in that service. So the future is bright, and have patience with us. Yeah, we'll try to make it work for everybody. Yeah.
Can you talk about composting worms?
Yes, I would love to. So worms are awesome, and you can't quite see it, but you can become a worm farmer. It's easy, it's done indoors, you can harvest every 2 to 3 months. No meat or dairy, they're vegetarians. They really don't like meat and dairy, it takes them too long to eat it. This is the bin I have, it's called a worm tower. But you can easily just make it in out of like a Rubbermaid tub or something like that. They too like a lot of carbon, more than you'd think. So again, it's their sugar. They need that sugar to get the energy to digest the protein. It's also a way to keep moisture in their bin. They like it a little bit wetter than an average compost pile. So I could teach a whole class on worms. And if I'd known there was interest, I might have brought mine on a field trip. Because they like to get out. They're all right with it.
You just imagine an accident.
Yeah. Well, they can actually live in the basement, but they will slow down. Yeah, their reproduction will slow down. If the temperatures are perfect and the conditions are perfect, they'll reproduce rapidly. So I have to be honest with you, I actually keep them just a little bit uncomfortable so that I don't end up with so many worms. Because I can't get enough people to, as enthusiastic as I am, that one's been like, give me some worms. So,
Not even the fishermen?
not even a, yeah, well, it's a different kind of worm. It probably would still work, but they're really thin, very thin. They're called red wigglers, and it does kind of matter. They like food scraps, that's what they eat. There are other red wigglers that really prefer manure. So anybody here have livestock? Or have you ever dug into a big pile of composted poop and seen lots of worms? Those are also red wigglers that are more native to our region. They like food. So vermiculture can be done on a huge scale, like there can be like a 400-foot long row on a table or in a trench, that's all vermiculture, or you can have like a little bin like this. There's a guy in Vermont called Tom Gilbert. He runs Black Dirt Farm up in the Northeast Kingdom. You can buy his worm castings in little 5-pound bags at stores. And he picks up food scraps from lots of area businesses and schools. He runs them through his chickens. Then he takes that partly done compost and gives it to his worms. And then they produce amazing castings. Yeah, it's a pretty good business. He's got a multi-enterprise and a side business of eggs.
You want to pick up your scraps.
Yeah. So worm bins are really great. They don't eat nearly enough food for me. They're my pets. I mean, they really are. I kind of like save out the very best food scraps for them. I really do. I have a special bowl for the worms. And that's just because I know like I should give them the best. And the rest goes into my compost bucket. I eat a lot of vegetables, so I do produce a lot of compost. But they're fun to have around, and I work with kids, so it's also a great tool, you know, for education and talking about digestion and decomposition and composting. Yeah.
When you have so many worms, can you put that worm in your garden?
Well, no, so I'm glad you asked that question. These worms are not native to our region. I mean, you may know that there actually are no worms native to North America except for the very southern parts of North America. So even earthworms, we have like 23 varieties of worms that live in our environment now. None of them used to be here. And that's just like humans and the way the world moves and birds and all sorts of things. And it's just the way it is. So these worms are not only not native, they can't survive our winters. Their eggs can't. So you'll only ever see like a 1-year-old worm. And I don't even think they can live long enough to like go deep to avoid the freeze and come back up. So they're not native to our region. That said, a compost pile is often an insulated spot where things can survive our winters, including diseases, right? Like you've probably heard, don't put diseased plants in the compost pile. I'm going to echo that because if you're not getting pathogen kill, those are some of the diseases. Like if you put a diseased tomato plant in your compost pile, you are now spreading those pathogens all through your compost, which is going to feed that pathogen out into your landscape when you use it, unless you're reaching pathogen kill. So just take your diseased plants and put them elsewhere.
But did not survive in the winter, this one. cannot put out a garden because it not survive.
Yeah, it won't survive, that's
Not
right.
because it's dangerous, they
Well,
invasive.
I mean, it is invasive, all worms are invasive. So, even the earthworms, you know, they're all invasive here, so if we can try to not reintroduce even more, that would probably be good. So I don't advocate for releasing them. That said, if you've ever picked through worm castings, you have to actually pick out worms and put them back in the bin. So I'm sure that I've released a few over the years.
So you bought it worm originally when you started?
You normally would do that, but I just found somebody who had them, and I went and got a handful of worms and put them in a bucket and brought them home. Didn't that make you feel good? Handful of worms.
I have a mother, worm, big, and they move very fast.
Oh.
And my daughter, and my daughter, she said that's an Asian snake worm.
Yeah. Does it move like a snake?
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
very fast, they jump right out and they. So
Yeah.
that's harmful to your garden or?
So those worms unfortunately don't like to eat food scraps, so they're not gonna work as a worm for vermiculture. Those worms came to us thanks to landscapers, garden centers. And they're here to stay. We don't know what to do about them. They're researching, there's a guy named Joseph Goris at UVM who's done a lot of research on them. And he's the most knowledgeable person on the planet, I think, about those particular worms. They can do a lot of damage to forests. That's one of the biggest concerns. So you're not really gonna find, you don't find worms in forests very often. They're like a garden and landscape sort of thing. Forests they haven't really co-evolved with worms. Microbes and mycelium fill that function in forests.
And she also said a native worm is smaller and they're not quite move that fast because,
Yeah,
so that.
yeah, those guys move fast.
Big guy and then jump out.
I think the most promising thing is to get chickens, because I'm pretty sure they'll eat them. But you gotta be quick, because those worms move fast. Yeah. So I think we're gonna be hearing a lot more about those worms in the future.
Excuse me, Pat, there's actually somebody coming in after our presentation, so I'm gonna have to ask everybody to give Pat a great
Thank you very much, and I'll leave you with, if you want to get in touch with me, you can take one of these, the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition thing. I forgot my business cards, but my business is Grow More, Waste Less. You can find me online.